Right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with John Thomas today. It's May 2nd, 2023. We're at Thomas Vineyard in Carlton. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
First question to get things rolling is why wine?
Good question. My background was geology. That's what I have a degree in, and not even a week out of college, I was about an hour south of the Yukon River in a construction camp, working on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And so we'd basically, half the pipeline, the whole pipeline, 800 miles, to half of it's on permafrost. And they realized after a couple years in design that the oil temperature is about 120 degrees. It was going to melt, sink, and so they couldn't bury the whole line. So we were hired as geotechs, and our job, basically, we'd sit around a drill rig all day, 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. And based on what was coming out of that particular augered hole, we would design a piling that would fit in there, and then you'd have a saddle, another piling maybe 10 feet away. And so you had an H shape, and the pipeline would sit on that, and so it would be above ground, and all was well as far as keeping it away from the permafrost. So, yeah, we'd just go out every day and stand around a drill rig, and you couldn't call them pilings because you'd have to hire the pile drivers union. So they were called VSMs, which was short for vertical support member. And that's where we learned that there was a kind of a corporate way of looking at things, and if you tweaked it in the right way, then you could save a lot of money. So but anyway, after one summer of that, and I was working night shift, which was kind of fun in a way, but you can only take so many pictures of moose in ponds, moose half in pond, moose out of pond, sunsets that were 4 hours long basically during the summer. And then it got towards fall, and you have the northern lights, so it's a pretty good job. But like I say, a lot of hours. We'd work 8 weeks straight, 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, and then you get a 2-week R&R. So to break up the monotony after a couple months, it was getting a little monotonous. So we decided we'd start doing. I started fondue parties on Friday nights, and didn't really know how to make fondue, but I knew wine was involved, so we were close enough to Fairbanks, we could find some wine, because the little town we were next to has a population that fluctuates anywhere between 12 people and 30 people, and so not even big enough to have wine in the general store. So we'd go down to Fairbanks, and the parties got bigger and bigger every Friday night, and we'd have to have more than one bottle of wine. So we started comparing, we go, hey, this Chardonnay is much different than that Chardonnay. And so then it kind of morphed into sort of quasi wine tastings more than fondue, because we were terrible at making fondue. Then after 3 years, pipeline ended, and followed a girlfriend back to Denver, Colorado. She wanted me to, I thought, move in, but once I got there, I realized our relationship hadn't quite congealed to that point. So she said, well, you need to get an apartment. I thought, well, okay. And there was a little liberal arts college, not unlike Linfield, that was maybe about 1.5 miles away. So I got an apartment close to that, and I would walk over every day to my girlfriend's house, and I happened to go past this pharmacy. And one day I went into the pharmacy, and it turned out it was half wine shop. So I'd pick up a bottle of wine, and a lot of her friends were musicians, and so I ended up staging wine tastings and underwriting a lot of the costs, because these musicians were kind of, didn't have solid 40-hour-a-week jobs by any means. Anyway, so that sort of piqued my interest in wine, and I got to the point where I was thinking, because in Alaska I had an offer to work in Saudi Arabia, and I thought, well, I'm going to do a little homework. So there were some guys there that had worked actually in Saudi Arabia building pipelines in the 50s, and I asked this one guy, I said, what would you take? You're kind of limited in the amount of clothing and gear you could take with you. And he said, well, and the most essential thing is a piece of rebar about 18 inches long, and you put that in the hip pocket of your Carhartt coveralls. And I thought, there must be some strange exotic animal I don't know about that you need to beat off with a piece of steel, concrete reinforcing steel. He said, no, it's actually, you'll be away from your pickup truck and a sandstorm will come up and you won't have time to get back to your truck. So you'll just get on the ground, pull your shirt over you, and just to filter the air out. And then once the sandstorm passes, if you go back to your truck and try to touch the door handle, you're going to get a static spark about that long. And so you ground your truck first before you even touch it. And after a story like that and a few others, I said, I don't think Saudi Arabia is my cup of tea. So followed my girlfriend to Denver because I knew a lot of oil companies, and there was a lot of geology going on in Denver at that time. And also there was the Colorado School of Mines close by. So I thought, well, I dabbled in this wine thing, but it wasn't really something at that point I thought I could make a living in. But I was interested enough to come out to the West Coast, and I started kind of on Vancouver Island, and I'd already looked at climate charts and whatnot, and Vancouver seemed kind of interesting. Right around, there's an area around Duncan, which is kind of the banana belt of Vancouver Island. And the problem was you had to have, all the wine sales were through government stores, and you had to have, at that time, 40 acres, which I thought was out of reach financially and physically. So that was kind of off the map. And then Eastern Washington was a little too hot, although I looked at, there's an area around Lake Chelan that I had visited when I was backpacking the Pacific Crest Trail in college down through Washington. Stopped at Lake Chelan, and I thought, this is a very scenic spot, and I knew it was plenty warm on the east end to grow grapes, but I wasn't sure about in the middle. So I looked up the frost freeze data, and it turned out the latest frost was something where like July 20th, and the first freeze was something like July 25th. And so you had a 5-day window. But that's not going to work. So then I came down to Oregon and kind of knocked on doors and just asked people, because I had this idea of I wanted to do something like 4 or 5 acres like you do in Burgundy, and do it all myself and have a small winery, and I just didn't know if that was a viable size economically. So that would be my question. I would, buttonhole people like David Alsheim and Myron, and usually, take a couple bottles of wine over and say, I'd like 20 minutes of your time if you can spare it, or I'll give you wine or pay you whatever you feel you need. And I just have like 5 or 6 questions. And one of them, the closing question was, can I make a living on 5 acres with own vineyard if I make build a lot of my own equipment and do all the work myself? And David Alsheim said, well, he said maybe 10 acres, and you might need a little help here and there, but yeah, and that was doable. And then I continued down the coast, and by the time I got to anywhere close to Napa, Sonoma, it was like 3 million, and you're going to need 40 acres of grapes, and I was about ready to just say, back to geology. This was an interesting, side trip, but it's not gonna work. And the last guy I was going to talk to was a guy named Ken Burnap, and he was in the Santa Cruz mountains. And it took me half a day to find him because this is pre-internet, and so you would be winding through these little river bottoms, and then you'd see a road that would go up, and I went up like half a dozen driveways that were not his driveway apparently. But you'd get to the top, and you'd come out, and you'd come out of the fog, and you'd see a vineyard here, and then you'd see another vineyard over there. They were just like a half a block away, seemingly, but to get there might take you several hours. You'd have to go down and back in the river bottom. But anyway, he had a gravity feed winery that he'd built himself. He'd been in construction, and so he did basically like we're doing here. He crushed down the roof. He had a few more levels because he had a bottling level, and so I just that that visit saved me. It kind of reinflated my dream, and I said, here's my background. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? And because I was tinkering with the idea of going to Davis, and I knew nothing about growing grapes or making wine, and he said, I'd just start working for people. And he said, you'll learn from their successes and failures. He said, you already have enough chemistry in your geology background that's no problem. So just start working for people. So I went over to Davis because I was still thinking about that. And I spent...
What year was this?
Oh gosh, this would have been 1979. And I spent about 2 weeks at Davis, go in there every morning. I was just camping out, go in there with just pockets full of quarters and dimes, and I would just go through most of their information was in French or German. I could read a little German, but nothing in French. But I wanted information on rootstocks particularly, because I knew that the rootstocks they used in California, like AXR and St. George, the vegetative cycle was way too long for Oregon. So there were a number of books, and as soon as I saw, a number that was like 3309, 3306, 10114, I knew I was on the right track, even though it was all French. So I would immediately take out some quarters and I would copy, reams of paper, and figured, well, I'll learn French later and I'll translate all this once I get to Oregon, right? So this went on for like a week, and then one time I was in the hallway and this guy said, we've been noticing you here a lot, but you're not a student here, so what exactly are you doing? And it was Rich Cushman. And I said, well, I'm thinking of going to Oregon and growing Pinot Noir. And he said, well, as luck has it, I'm from Hood River, and that's where I'm going as soon as I finish my degree. And then he found out I was camping out, and he said, well, some other guys and I are sharing a house here in town. Why don't you just, forget driving 20 miles every day and just stay on the couch? And so I did that for a few nights. And so the guys in the house were Rollin Souls was one of them. A few other people that I've since forgotten ended up in California. But so through those connections, I got my foot in the door at Con Creek Winery, and I worked down there in Crush 1980, and learned kind of the nuts and bolts of winemaking. Actually made like a quarter barrel of Pinot. They sold grapes to Domaine Chandon, which they'd pick in, early August, but they'd always miss a few. So I asked the owner if it'd be okay if I went out there and gleaned some fruit. And so I did that and made a quarter barrel of Pinot. So worked there through harvest and into the winter, and then spent a little bit of time in the vineyard because I wasn't sure. I'd never been in a vineyard myself, and I didn't know what was involved and for physically what it was like. So we went out, I remember one day it was about 92 degrees and 2 in the afternoon or whatever, and they would always put me next to the road because I was the only Caucasian guy. And the guys working farther up the hill were less and less legal, to the point where the guys closest to the woods were pretty dicey as far as their citizenship. So if the immigration bus came by, the idea was they'd see me and think things were okay. And if they didn't, at least the guys close to the woods had time to hightail it out of there. But anyway, it got so hot that afternoon, they said, everybody go home, we're calling it a day. And I thought, well, okay, I can handle that heat. So then I got a hold of Rich again, and he said, well, if you want to go up to Oregon, this fellow Bob McRitchie I know pretty well, and he's the winemaker at Sokol Blosser, and so I'll give you his phone number. So I called Bob, and he said, yep. He said, we need some people. 95% chance we'll have a job for you. So packed everything in the car, headed north, and got here. Bob said, well, we've canceled night shift because the crop is so small this year. And I thought, night shift? What are you guys working night shift for? And then it come to find out they would run their press 24 hours a day instead of hiring 2 crews. So without enough grapes, they shut that down. And so I had already rented a place to live. unpacked everything, put everything in a storage. You store it. And there weren't that many wineries around. I mean, there was Newts and Erath, there was Tualatin, Zari, a couple others, and even then, this is 1981, even then David Lett was pretty much an icon, and I just couldn't quite screw my courage up to go over there and see if he needed people. But after 2 weeks, I realized I don't have any money coming in, and I'm going to have to do something. So I went over there, and he had a sledgehammer. He was knocking out some concrete on his crush pad so he could get a press in there. And this was about, like 10 days before people had to start picking. And I said, well, do you have a crush crew lined up? And he said, no, I'm thinking about it. And I thought, what an odd way to run a winery. But evidently he called Bob McRitchie, I guess, later that day, and then he called me back, and I checked out. So he said, you've got a job. And so I worked there for 3 weeks until we ran out of fruit. But every day before harvest, the building didn't have any windows, so he would go to the door, and he'd open it, and he'd look outside, and it'd be dripping, and he'd say, well, maybe tomorrow, and this went on for like a week. And I'd never seen rain in Napa. Back there, I heard stories where if it rained even 1/8 of an inch, panic ensued, And so I was starting to wonder about A, Oregon, and B, David Lett. But finally, after about a week, he opened the door and he said, I think it's going to clear tomorrow. I think we'll pick. And we picked. But then one day we paid, I guess it was on a Friday. They just paid the pickers a day early, which I guess was a mistake because they went out, purchased beer. We're in no shape to pick the next day. So Joel and I picked some Chardonnay, and I remember putting it on the truck. He had an old 1940s flatbed, and it was getting dark, and we just thought, well, we're not going to drive it all the way into McMinnville. We'll just drive it around the road up Bremen Orchard, put it in the barn overnight. So Joel says, if you take it slow, and he said, you know how to drive a truck with straight gears? And I said, yeah, you just clutch, I said. So I start going up the road, and truck's got a 1940 old engine, and we only had like 1.5 tons of Chardonnay in there, but that was heavy enough that the truck started to stall. And then by the time I downshifted and found the gear, popped the clutch, I could feel the truck suddenly getting a lot lighter. And we turned around, and there was a ton of Chardonnay in the road, and we spent another 2 hours shoveling that back into these Smuckers picking bins. And big wet spot on the road. David never said anything to me the next day. I thought he was going to maybe fire me, I don't know. But yeah, so we ran out of grapes, and he found me a job at Tualatin. I worked up there, finished up harvest, and in fact ended up working, another 2 harvests at Tualatin, 83 and 84, and one in between at Elk Cove in 82. And in the meantime, I'd worked at all these various wineries and gotten to know some people, so I started a little wine tasting group. In fact, we had it, the second year I planted the vineyard, we had it right at the bottom there. Alan Holstein was in it, Alan Sally Holstein, Bill and Julia Wayne, Mark Benoit, who started Oregon Vineyard Supply. Mark actually, he looked at the vineyard. It was the first time I'd had anybody over other than Bill Wayne to look at the vineyard, and both Alan and Mark were vineyard managers. And I remember Mark looking at the vines and looking at the spacing, and he said, by next year, he said, you're not going to be able to see the rows in July. They're just going to grow in on one another, because back before I purchased this, I'm getting ahead of myself, but before I purchased this, I'd gotten interested when I was still in Napa Valley in Burgundian spacing. And I'd had some Oregon wines even when I lived in Denver that were fairly light. I think that was more the climate than the grape trellising, but I thought, well, on visits to Oregon, I haven't seen anybody that's done a Burgundian spacing. They're talking about growing Burgundian varieties, but and maybe the winemaking is Burgundian, but there weren't any vineyards that looked like that. So I thought, well, what if I, instead of the 9x6, I do something. This is 1.5 meters by 9/10 of a meter, so it's a little over 3,000 vines to the acre. And at that time, in the 80s, 9x6 got you something like 800 vines to the acre, so it's pretty dense. And so I wasn't sure what was going to happen, and I found this particular spot because I had been looking for a couple of years. I think everybody does that. You get on the limestone kick. I had the whole map of California, the West Coast, every speck of limestone marked out. And then you find out that if the limestone is like far enough away from town to a point where there's no concrete plant next to it, then it's so hot, like where Chalon is, that's so limestone was kind of out. There's really none that I could find in Oregon, but so I did that for a while. There was a little vineyard outside St. Helena that Sterling, and I would go up there on Sundays off when I was working at Con Creek, because they had this little showcase vineyard that was meter by meter, and occasionally you'd run into these, and invariably somebody had a rototiller, and that's the only way you could cultivate or do anything. But so I would go up there on Sundays, and they had Zinfandel apparently growing, and it was all raisined up, and so I would take raisins and I'd throw them in my granola for the rest of the week. And I went in there finally one time on a Monday and found the vineyard manager, and I said, I'm really curious about this little vineyard that's meter by meter. And I said, when was it planted? And he said, well, Zinfandel. And I said, well, what does the winemaker think of the fruit? And he said, the winemaker hates this vineyard. I said, well, why is that? He said, well, it ripens before Chardonnay. He said, well, they're still processing white varieties. They don't want just a small, 10-ton lot of red coming in, because they're not prepared to handle it. So he hates it. We just let it dry up to raisins, and it's just kind of something for the tourists to drive past on their way up to the winery. And so I told him, I said, well, I'm thinking about growing grapes like this in Oregon. And he said, well, that might work. But he said, he said it ripens too early. So I thought, okay. And then I got up here and asked, like Dick Erath, his first vineyard was over on Dopp Road. It was on Willakenzie soil, which is what this is. And he said, well, that fruit was my favorite fruit from Willakenzie. And I didn't know if it was the climate, but I attribute it to the soil. Because I was looking for something that was fairly shallow. Even though our climate's much different here than Burgundy, we probably won't get any more rain until September. And in Burgundy, it might be raining every week until September. So there was that. But I thought if I had Jory soil, that was just too much water, and the vines might just grow rampant. And so I was looking for Willakenzie, and it took me, 2 years to find something. I ended up, this place just found on a fluke, because I wasn't looking in the Dundee Hills at all. I knew it was Jory soil that was going to be too deep, and but my friend Bill Wayne knew the farmer over here where Ambar is going up, and that fellow could look over here. And at this point, back in the 80s, this was an Italian prune orchard, and the fellow that farmed over there said, well, the guy hadn't seemingly been working it for a couple of years, and he might be interested in selling. Well, Bill told me this, and I thought, no, it's the Dundee Hills. It's going to be, A, it's going to be the wrong soil, Jory. B, it's going to be sloping off in the wrong direction to the north, and it's probably going to be too high. And so, but I thought, well, just to humor him, I'll get out my topo map, pulled it out, and I found, it's this little ridge that's sticks out, and it's got a southeast exposure, which is what I was looking for. And then I got out the soils map, and I found, wow, this is all sedimentary soil, pretty much from the Bonneville power lines. This way, it's all sedimentary soil. So it was the right soil, and it was the right elevation, and the guy wanted to sell. So yeah, I figured I was looking for 5 to at the most 10 acres, and this was a little over 25, and I thought, this is way too much land. I'm either going to go bankrupt. It's going to be a binary thing. Either I'm going to go bankrupt or I'm going to be successful, in which case I'll have a big buffer against my neighbors and I can plant out more if I decide to. But, so yeah, I wound up with it, and I had some cuttings I'd made from Bill's Vineyard at Abbey Ridge that were down in Corvallis at a friend's farm. So I hauled those up, and gosh, a week after we closed the deal, I was planting vines here and put a little travel trailer like everybody did back then at the bottom of the vineyard, and got frosted the second year. We had a Mother's Day frost, which we hadn't had anything that severe up until last year. So yeah, the first, 3 years, I had a diesel Italian rototiller, single cylinder, rope start, that would just about, if you didn't have it at top dead center, when you pulled that rope, it would just about, you'd feel your shoulder be sore for a couple days. But after, 1987, Drin came in, and I thought, well, this area is going to take off. And I thought, I'll use that to justify buying a small tractor. It was still a little tight, but it worked. And yeah, so first vintage was in 1988, and I made that at Cameron Winery. I had an old, it's a bulk dairy tank that was 2,500 gallons. So I cut that in half. Another neighbor who's a good welder showed me how to weld some legs on it, and so I made two jacketed, insulated wine tanks that each hold probably about 5 tons. So we can pick, that's one of the luxuries I wanted to have. One was to be able to pick everything in to have the fermentation capacity to handle all the fruit, so you weren't constrained by weather or having to, get a fermentation done and get those grapes out so you could load it a second time. I wanted to have enough space for everything. And I also wanted to have a barrel room where everything was on one level, because it's 90% of what's going on in a wine you can tell just with your nose. And so just when you're topping, you just take a little sniff, just pull the bung, and you know if you've got a problem or not. So yeah, some of the equipment I've managed to build, like a hedger, because when you're this small, and back then Oregon Vineyard Supply they were selling equipment, but there was really nothing in the way of a good small vineyard tractor. So people would get, once Drouin came in, and people started tightening up their row spacings, then people would get these John Deere 750s, and they would have them cut the axle. A great expense, it was like a third the cost of the tractor just to cut the axles and squeeze them in 4 or 5 inches so you could get down these rows. And then Oregon Vineyard Supply started selling these Ferrari tractors that were gorgeous. They were articulated, but they had a phenomenally odd gear range. They had about, I think like 20 gears, and only 2 of them were usable in the vineyard. The top speed was something like close to 40 miles an hour. And I asked somebody who was Italian, who had a winery, and I said, why are there so few useful vineyard gears? Because when you're rototilling, a lot of the things you do in a vineyard, you're going at a speed that's barely faster than walking. And I said, why do you need a 40-mile-an-hour tractor? Well, he said, a lot of these guys, they don't have a barn out in their vineyard. They live in town. And so if you leave your tractor out in the vineyard, somebody will steal it. So you drive your tractor, that's your car every day. So they worked great for that, but as vineyard devices, I don't know. But anyway, so yeah, first vintage was in 88. And then 89, 89 I did it at what's now, it's Chehalem. It was Veritas. In fact, I worked at Veritas when Rex Hill opened in 1985. Bill Wayne and I, everybody in the county went to this new winery because they had just opened, and it was it was a fancy winery, let's put it that way. Everything before that was built with practicality in mind, and it wasn't a show place. But this place, the doors were, I don't know, 12 feet high, and Persian carpets on the floor. They had barrels full of wine off the tasting room, glass bungs that disappeared quickly for the next couple months. People were pilfering those. And, but it was really a beautiful winery. And I was going up the stairwell with Bill Wayne, and I started conversing with this other fellow. Well, it was John Howison, and he had just built Veritas across the street. He needed an assistant winemaker, and so I worked there for 2 years, and also worked at Nick's, moonlighting. You were, doing many different things at that point just to keep gas in the truck tank. So I had wine made there and previous vintage, and I didn't have the winery wasn't finished at that point. I didn't have the barrel rooms. They were years later. But I hadn't poured concrete on the top. I'd run out of money. Thought I had enough saved from Alaska, but it turns out that wineries are more expensive than, it's about, everything takes twice as long and 3 times as expensive as you think. I'd heard about this place down the road, the Trappist Abbey. I heard that they were getting out of the furniture business because they'd been building church pews. And I went down there just to check out this rumor that they were going to be storing wine for small wineries. And the abbot, I can't remember his name, but I told him, I said, I'm here. They had a huge warehouse with nothing in it. And I said, I hear you're planning on storing wine for small wineries. And he said, yes. And are you a small winery? And I said, yes. And he said, do you have wine to store? And I said, yes, I do. I have about 10 barrels of wine and some carboys. And I said, but it's not bottled, it's bulk wine, and I don't think that's going to be legal to do. And while I was explaining this, he goes into his file cabinet and he pulls out this form and he signs his name here, and he said, how many barrels do you have? And I said, 10. And he said, well, how many cases of wine are in a barrel? And I said, 25. So he does that and a couple carboys, and he writes 263 cases, and he says, sign here. And I said, well, I still don't think this is quite legal. I don't think you can. He said, let me worry about that, and we'll send you an invoice at the end of the month. So I was their first customer, and I would go in there, usually with a carboy of wine about every couple weeks, and walk the length of that building, which was no easy trick, top up the barrels, and usually I would meet. There was one monk who would always seem to appear every time I went over there to top barrels, and it turned out he was the kind of a thorn in the abbot's side, because he didn't buy fruit. He would get these wine kits mailed to him, and then you just add water and you start fermenting, and that would have been fine, but he always submitted the wines to the state fair, and he was winning gold medals, so the abbot couldn't really ignore him and tell him to stop, because he had a bit of a reputation in the home winemaking world. So things like that were kind of interesting. And then eventually my barrels kind of got shoved off into a side warehouse to the point where I had to walk on the top of the barrels. They were packed in so tightly to top, because everything else was starting to come in. The warehouse business was taking off, and they had actual wineries that had bottled wine in there. So, yeah. So first vintage was 88, and then it was in barrel longer than I really wanted to have it. So it was released later. I'd already kept it in barrel for 2 years, and then an additional almost another year. So by the time I actually got around to getting it bottled and taking it into town, it was kind of I was feeling a little sheepish. So I said 1988 reserve, and I never lived that down. That took about 7 or 8 years, because I would come out with a vintage and people would say, well, when's the reserve coming out? I go, oh. People have an institutional memory. Like every time you make rosé, if you make one rosé, and 10 years later, people are still saying, when's the next rosé coming out? And you go, oh, no. But anyway, the first I can remember going in, having not sold any wine, and at that point, you know, you've had all these construction expenses, vineyard expenses. You're really wanting to get some cash flow. And so I had a car full of wine, drove in, and then I had a map of like the 20 different wine shops I was going to stop in, restaurants. And I got close to the Twilliger curves, and I thought, you know, maybe I should start from the end of the list and then I'll work my way back. And I realized, no, you're just procrastinating. I'd sold encyclopedias one summer in college, door to door. And I said, no, you're just procrastinating. You know, you got to just bite the bullet and get off Twilliger exit and go to Burlingame Grocery. So I pulled out a sample bottle and I walked in the store thinking, well, I'm just going to give samples out to everybody and maybe I'll hear back, maybe not. But certainly not going to sell any wine today. Walked in there with a bottle, and the wine steward, Richard, he says, oh, he looked at the label and he said, are you John Thomas? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I've been waiting for you for like a year now. And he said, do you have any wine with you? And I said, yeah, he said, I'll take 2 cases. And I said, you don't even want to taste it? And he said, no, I've been hearing about you for years from John Paul. You know, I've just been waiting. And it turned out this whole day was kind of like that. You'd walk in, they'd say, you John Thomas? I've heard about you, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, that made life a lot easier. Yeah. Plus, you know, the fact that, and we were sort of the second generation, John Paul, myself, Russ Rainey. In fact, there was a sommelier emailed me a couple weeks back, and he said, as one of the pioneers, we'd like to get some of your vintages, older vintages, on our wine list. And I said, I'm not a pioneer. I said, you could call us sons of the pioneers, but not pioneers. I said, that's David Alsheim and Lett and Bill Fuller and guys like that.
I want to talk a little bit about life before all of that. So tell me about where you're born and raised, and what prompted you sort of down the geology track.
Born and raised in Lansing, East Lansing, Michigan. Grew up like one house away from a GM Fisher body plant. So walking to elementary school was basically 8 blocks of Fisher body plant. And then the high school was another block away. So you'd hear, it was kind of a toss-up of what you were going to hear that night, if it was going to be the high school football game or the guys stamping out bumpers and fenders at the body plant. But no wine drinking really in my background with my parents. It was mostly, they enjoyed cocktails and, you know, beer, and we'd have, I think it was called Cask. It was a Finger Lakes wine. It was cooking wine, but you could tell just from, of course, it sat next to the stove for months at a time, so it wasn't going to improve much. But I made some mead, I guess, at one point when I was in college, and but it wasn't really until I was in Alaska that the wine bug bit. And you know, I got interested in geology just because everything else seemed like it was interesting, but like architecture was interesting, but I hate drafting. It seemed like marine biology was interesting, but you end up, if you want to make any money, you're working for the government. What else was there? Cinematography, you know, when I was running into dead ends pursuing wine, I applied to a number of graduate schools in engineering geology, thinking that would be a good fallback position. But was down in LA interviewing at USC, and was eventually accepted. But you know, part of the reason for USC was I knew they had a great film school, and I thought maybe I can dabble in a little cinematography while I'm pursuing engineering geology. Second time I went down there, the smog was so bad my eyes were burning before I even got 30 miles from LA, and I thought, you know, that, and you ended up having to get a master's degree by working for somebody during the day and going to school at night, and so it was going to take, it wasn't just a 2-year program, it was more like a 4-year program. And So the wine thing got more and more appealing. But it's a little daunting when you've never farmed in your life and never made wine, but consumed a lot of books. And when we started, there were, like my friend Bill had some connections in England, and there was a woman named Gillian Pierkes that had a small vineyard in England, and she'd done a lot of research because none of us, I think the problem with the Oregon industry when we started, and a number of other people in interviews have alluded to this, is that no one was really focused on what was going on in France. I mean, David Alsheim was fluent in German and a couple other people, and so a lot of the technical stuff, the viticulture end of it was kind of migrated from Germany. And of course the Germans were better experimenters than the French were, and so that helped, and they tended to write everything down. We had books called, there was one called The Climate Near the Ground, which was really interesting because I had taken a few meteorology courses in college, and these guys in Germany were experimenting with temperatures at various heights with various trellis widths and various ground covers, and this was back in the 50s, just after World War II, and wrote it all down, and it was really interesting because you think about just all the little microclimates that are involved, and especially when you start pushing your density higher and higher. And it was kind of interesting because I think it was the third year that this was planted. Robert Drouin came over because when they first started their vineyard in '87, they couldn't get a straddling tractor from France over, so they planted 7-foot rows and 5 feet in. I think it was 5 feet in the row, but they were going to go to a higher density to I guess it's 1.3 by 1. So really, you're at that density, at that row width, you need a straddling tractor. So he was kind of curious because I knew Bill Wayne and his wife, Deborah, they had come out from Michigan also when I was working at Veritas. So it was one Friday during the summer, and they came by, and they'd been out at a bed and breakfast down on the coast, and the guy that owned the bed and breakfast said, "You really should stop by Veritas and try some of their wine." So they came by. And we hit it off because we grew up within about 30 miles of one another, it turned out. And Bill, they had just remodeled the house, I guess it was in St. Louis, and sold it. And Bill was pushing to just go to Europe and spend all the money and come back and get a job. And Deborah was pushing to kind of take a vacation out here and maybe look for possibilities for other careers. And so we talked for, like an hour, and Bill ended up said, "Well, if we really wanted to pursue this a little bit more, what should we do?" And I said, "Well, why don't you keep in touch, because we need some people to work harvest this fall, and if you wanted to learn, I would suggest working harvest, and if you still enjoy the business at the end of harvest, then maybe the wine business is for you, but you'll find out immediately within 6 weeks whether you enjoy this or not." And so it was just like my job at Con Creek. It was something that I thought was going to fall together. I kept in touch. The guy who was the assistant winemaker at Trefethen became the winemaker at Con Creek. I kept in touch with him, and he said, "Sure, come on out." Had a job. So you make these little connections that you think are not that useful at the time, but down the road, they're very useful. So anyway, since I knew Bill and Deb, and Bill ended up managing Domaine Drouin and really overseeing construction of that place for the first, he was there for 13 years, I think. But anyway, so Robert Drouin came out, and I was flattered that he was wanting to come visit, but at the same time I had this weed that was called panicle willow herb, and it was growing up into the fruit zone so the vineyard was just embarrassingly bad. But he came out, didn't say anything about the weeds, and I guess figured out that I didn't have a problem of too much vigor, on the soil, and so they went ahead and planted their, gosh, I don't know how many acres they have now, but.
So you mentioned obviously getting into this without having farmed before, without having made wine before, and obviously trying to learn through books and through kind of trial and error. So tell me about the first sort of, we'll start with your first harvest. Start when you're still in California. Tell me about first harvest experience. You talk about how that's kind of a like, you're going to know pretty quickly whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. What did you like about it? What made you think that was something you wanted to keep doing?
Well, it's fascinating having both a winery and a vineyard because it's almost two different mindsets. You know, the decisions you make in the vineyard, you can like chew on a decision for a week or maybe 2 weeks. Decisions in the winery kind of have to be made within a matter of hours because you've got fermentations. Do you cool this fermentation down? Do you warm it up? Do you when you punch down, all sorts of things like that. And so it was really interesting also working in a winery that not only did they have their own estate fruit, but they purchased from, gosh, probably 8 different growers. So you'd have all these fermentations and I thought, well, the owner's fruit is always going to make the best wine. No, never did. And just everything and the flavor profiles of grapes coming from the same vineyard. You'd have, Cabernet when it's a little underripe, it's kind of a bell peppery, not green, but it just has some herbaceous characters to it. I mean, Cabernet is herbaceous anyway. But then you'd reach kind of this bell curve where you'd get just pure Cabernet, and then when it was a little bit overripe, you start getting chocolate and Bing cherry, and the same thing happens with Pinot. I think it probably happens with every grape, but there's an optimal point depending on what your palate is to pick those. So just learning little things like that is fascinating, and there's a lot of just basic mechanical knowledge that I guess I'm fairly good at. So you'd see something and you could figure out a way around it. And a lot of vineyard and winery stuff is what's the workaround. Because you can't get a part flown in from Germany or something like that. You have to improvise. I tell people starting out, I said, one of the first things you get after a tractor and a sprayer is get yourself a welder. I said, if you're in college, you have a guitar, that's your creative outlet. If you have a winery, you get a welder, that's your creative outlet. You can build your own equipment, you can just go to a steel yard and grab stuff and just paste it together basically and design your own stuff. So
with the vineyard here, obviously you mentioned kind of a radical spacing, or at least for the time, radical spacing here. So tell me about getting the vineyard in, and what were the sort of the bumps along the way? What were the big learning moments for you as you were getting the vineyard online?
Well, the first year was relatively easy. I didn't realize how easy because it was such a wet spring. And virtually everything I put in the ground survived. I mean, some were luxuriant. They were growing, I had 6-foot long canes at the end of the year. And I thought, well, this is not hard at all, And then we get to the second year, 1985, and because I ran out of vines, I thought I had plenty of vines, but then, you dig them out of the ground and you find that some just don't have much of a root system, and they're just dwarfs basically. So, just put those on the burn pile. And so I planted probably 2/3 of the vineyard the first year. And then the last of it, the lower part, planted in 85, and that was such a hot, it was kind of a more typical Oregon summer. It just, suddenly the rain stopped and it got hot, and I was thinking, well, how am I going to water these vines? And so I went over to Peter Adams' vineyard. They were friends with Bill and Julia and had been around for a long time. In fact, Russ Rainey was a winemaker for them. They had probably the first urban winery in Portland. And they had just a pile of old rusted number 10 cans, and that's what people would use. This was like predated the milk carton business, So threw those in my truck, put them around all the vines, and it turned out they just reflected the heat onto the vine and make it even hotter. I lost more vines that way. So the first year, I think I lost probably 10% of the vines that I planted versus none the year before. So that was an eye-opener. Then the frost we had, Mother's Day frost, I went out from my little trailer, I knew it was cold, and I went out just before sunup. It was like 5 in the morning, and I looked out because I'd spent 2 weeks. Everybody, would use bamboo stakes back then instead of steel pencil rod, and I'd tied up all these vines and taken 2 weeks to do it, so they were all up about that high on the bamboo. Went out at 5 in the morning, and I looked, and everything was green, and I go, great, start making breakfast. Then the sun comes up, and turned out all the vines, they were green, but they were frozen. And so as soon as the sun hit them, they started going like that, turning black. And I thought, another 2 weeks going back out. Yeah, so there are those setbacks. We always had birds. We haven't had, actually, this interesting thing in the last probably 3 years, there just haven't been many birds. And I don't know if it was the smoke issue we had in 2020, it changed the migratory patterns, or if it's just the fact that it's been getting warmer progressively since 2014. So maybe that has something to do with it, but 2020 and 2021, virtually no birds. And so there are people including myself, that have piles of bird netting stashed somewhere that we'll probably never use again. We'll probably not chaptalize again. I think the last time I did that was 2011. Now we're more worried about heat, and I don't pull leaves anymore. I've changed probably the pruning, thinning technique 4 times since I started this. At first we had, my fruiting wire was about 12 inches off the ground when I started. And I ended up, the first couple of years we picked, I borrowed Cameron's picking crew because I didn't have my own. And turned out they referred to this as Las Fresas vineyard because it's the strawberries, and it was like bending over having to, So after Dren went in, I went over there and looked at their trellis, and I thought, I think I can raise this up just a little bit and I'll last a lot longer, at least my back will. So I did that, and then at this density, generally I'd have maybe 6 shoots and a renewal. And then every August, of course, I was pulling leaves because I'd always have a little too much crop. And usually if you got 2 clusters, which is average per shoot. So you'd pull leaves and then you'd drop things down to 1 cluster per shoot. And about 5 years ago, I came back from Burgundy and I said, why am I out here in August doing this? I should just thin more severely. So now I thin to 3 shoots in a renewal, which is, it's rolling the dice, because if you get wet weather during bloom and not everything pollinates, then you're short in your crop. But if everything comes in on average, then no thinning is involved.
What about sort of learning that? As you decided this was going to be something you were going to do yourself, you were going to be out here doing the work. What about sort of, how long did it take you to learn the annual cycle of what you had to do when and how long you had to do it?
It took about, 7 or 8 years, hit or miss. Yeah, and because somebody would always want to drag you off on vacation for a week at the wrong time. I knew I was never going to get to Burgundy during harvest, and one year I had the chance to go in, this was 2018, had the chance to go, but it was the mid-May. And I said, I just really can't imagine getting away from the vineyard then. Everything's going to town. But at the same time, it's going to be 2 weeks in Burgundy. So I thought, I really should. I'm not going to get there otherwise. So I did it. came back, and man, I barely got the catch wires up. I had to just, it's like doing a bench press basically for 3 days straight. And so it wasn't pretty, but the vineyard was fine, the fruit was fine. And it's a lot of fun, after having read all the stuff about Burgundy and how they do this and that, and going there after you've planted your own vineyard and realizing that we were in La Romanie. And I put my foot up like this, to the top of the trellis. I was a little more flexible back then. And I go, I can almost do this on my vineyard, and the rows were clean cultivated like this and shoot thinning. I go, wow, at least I'm doing something right. So, I'd love to go back during harvest, but that's going to have to wait until retirement, I think.
So let's talk about the winemaking then, as the sort of the next part of that. Tell me about developing your style and learning to work with Pinot Noir specifically. How long did it take you to figure out what you wanted to make and how to get there?
I kind of knew what the style of wine, the Pinot I like is maybe a little more austere than most of the Pinots I'd had at that point. Certainly more austere than California Pinots that I'd had. I wasn't afraid of putting something out in the marketplace that needed some bottle age, and I felt that people were willing to be patient enough. If the flavor profile seemed right, I thought it was very important to keep the alcohol down, which wasn't a problem back in the 80s. Got to be a problem in the 90s, but I was just trying to make wine that I myself wanted to drink. And what you can do, my production level is about 600 cases a year, and if I was really large, then you'd be more swayed by your perception of what does the market want, and so you'd probably be making something that's easier to drink, more approachable when it's young, not as tannic, not as much acid. But as it is, some of the older vintages, 94 was a vintage that was just a wonderful vintage when it was young, but I thought, this is a really big, broad-shouldered vintage, and I would tell people, drink this within 6 years. I don't think it's going to last. And we've just had a couple bottles a few months ago, and it's still hanging in there, So I think that's the most surprising thing to me about Pinot, because originally I was thinking things weren't going to last more than 10 years. And I think I heard Veronique say that of all the vintages they made at Drouhin, only 97 was the one that she felt hadn't held up. And that was a very cold, wet vintage, lots of botrytis. We sorted lots of botrytis, and had to open a Magnum a couple months back just to see what it was like. And it's seen better days, but it by the same token, towards the end of the evening, and admittedly, I was probably drinking most of the bottle. But towards the end of the evening, it was really kind of coming into its own, to the point where I'm tempted to open another one and just see. I think I have like 3 left. So, but that's fun to see. Originally, when I started selling wine, I was selling a lot to California, and now I sell very little. I mean, I sell to people on the mailing list to California, but I don't have any large accounts, whereas now I have probably 15% of my sales are to Europe. So that to me says that I'm on the right track if I'm trying to come up with a wine that can kind of stand on its own with Burgundy.
Let's talk about selling wine, because obviously you have a fairly unique model and approach now at Thomas Wine. So tell me about, you mentioned kind of having a head start in terms of people having talked about your wine before you even took it out to the market. Mm-hmm. Tell me how your selling has evolved and why you've chosen to kind of sell the wine the way you have.
Well, certainly the mailing list has evolved to the point where I never thought it would. Back when I started, I had been, like I say, working at Nick's for a couple years, so they all know my phone number, and and I worked at Tina's, worked at Red Hills, occasionally just filling in when somebody needed a waiter, and of course I always needed some money. But so when IPNC started, invariably it seemed like I would get these calls from people that had been to a restaurant, been to Tina's or Nick's or Red Hills, and it would be Sunday night. Everybody disperses, the event's over, and everybody's on their own for dinner. And they would go out and they'd look at the wine list and they say, well, do you have something that I didn't see at IPNC? And the waiter would say, well, here, try this, and they'd have it. And of course, I didn't have anything on the bottle that indicated where I was, or, there was just a little government warning thing that I hand pasted on. And so I would get a call and they'd say, I was at the Tina's the other night, had your wine, loved it. They gave me your phone number, and I'd go, oh, great, and so to stall them off, I gave them the truth. I'd said, well, I don't have any wine right now, and that's the reason I'm not in IPNC, and but I'll have some in the fall when I'm bottling, so give me a call then. And I would hope that they'd lose this little scrap of paper and be done with it, but it turned out they didn't. And so, the first year was like a dozen people, and then you get a dozen more, and then it kind of snowballs. And I think now it's to a point where probably a third of my production is a mail list. And you get these letters from, there'll be a town like in Iowa, and you look at the address and you go, gosh, the name of that town sounds familiar. And you realize, well, there's a guy on the list already. He's a doctor. Well, doctors hang out together, and so this other doctor goes over for a dinner party, blah, blah, blah. It kind of works like that. Lawyers, doctors, dentists. So that's about a third, probably another half, I would guess, is retailers in Portland. But I don't have any distributors, really, to speak of, which, good and bad. I mean, it's nice to sell to a distributor because you get one fat check and just take it over to the Abbey, a mile down the road, and done deal. As long as the distributor is financially healthy. And I've had a few that haven't been, and other people in the same boat. So it's kind of nice to have a check arrive before you even send the wine back to somebody. It's just the hurdles of the all-state wine laws that's probably the biggest snafu at this point. And then, I do a few restaurants, but mostly in the county because I'm out in the vineyard all summer, so it's really hard to supply somebody in Portland. But it's just down to the point where I release wine November 1st, and hopefully it's all pretty much gone by February, and then go on vacation and come back and start the vineyard. And season begins again.
And so you've never had the desire to get bigger or to have employees or to make more wine?
No, that's the question I get most often, is that people come up here and they say, well, how many acres do you have? And I said, well, 25 plus. And I said, well, is it all plantable? And I said, well, pretty much all of it. And they said, well, why don't you? And I said, well, I've worked for too many people that they think, well, if I do 600 cases at X dollars a case, if I double my production, then I can be making twice as much money. But the reality is, you've got to hire a vineyard manager, you've got staff, and then you've got to take on distributors, and it just becomes something where I would be doing, lots of trade shows, and you're doing winemaker dinners around the country, and you're talking to banks about your loan, and as it is, I can just go out in the vineyard and I don't have to worry about any of that. So, there's some trade-offs. If I'm not out in the vineyard, work's not getting done. But at the same time, I don't have those other worries, and I just prefer that. I'd much rather, the first guy that we worked for, Con Creek, the winemaker didn't trust the owner to top his own barrels, because he thought he'd get sidetracked and, screw something up. So he wasn't allowed down in the cellar, which I thought was a little odd. It seems like once you have investors involved, the investor usually has plenty of money, but he doesn't have any idea of how the marketing works, and so he has ideas that he would like to do something, but they're not rational ideas, let's put it that way. So you're dealing with that. So if you can do something like I've done, the first 10 or 15 years are the hardest, whereas if you have an investor, it's easy. The hard part with an investor is the tail end of the deal, when everybody is trying to get out from underneath the winery and retire, and you find out that, well, there's not that much money in it. It's just like restaurants, So at least if you're in the business by yourself, you have the value of the property, which has certainly increased. As when I first started, I've got 6 contiguous neighbors here, and now 3 of those have vineyards. So I think it'll just be a matter of time before maybe the blackberries down here are another vineyard, and who knows. But don't know where all the wine's going to go, but I've been saying that for 30 years and been proven wrong every year.
You mentioned sort of the first decade or so being the biggest challenge. So tell me about some of the sort of odd jobs or sort of odd living arrangements you had to kind of come up with to make it through while you were getting this going.
Gee, I was an easy sell for house sitting. Anytime anyone on Warden Hill Road wanted to go to Europe or take a vacation to California, need somebody to house sit, I was right there. I house sat for Dick Erath when he built his new house up on Prince Hill. And it was so funny because you would drive in there and he had he said Ernie Munch, the same fellow that designed Domaine Drouin, designed Bill's house, and Dick Erath's house. And it had so many kitchen cabinets that contained virtually nothing because Dick didn't eat that much, big guy, but so you'd be in the kitchen and, you'd remember seeing sugar in a cupboard, and then you'd shut that cupboard and 2 minutes later you go, where did I see the sugar? There are 50 of these. And then all the posts out here are metal. One time Bill and Julia Wayne were on vacation, I think it was California, for a couple of weeks, wanted me to house sit, and I thought, well, it's the dead of winter, can't do anything in the vineyard, but I had all these posts, and when I first worked at Irie in the vineyard, my job was replacing rotten vineyard posts because their spacing is so wide, they have maybe like 300, 400 vines to the acre. It's 10 by 12. So David had purchased all these old treated bean poles that were like 2-inch square. Well, there's one post at every vine, and some of those were rotting out after 20 years, 15 years. So I spent a couple days doing that, and I said, at the end of that, I said, if I ever have a vineyard, I'm going to have steel posts. I don't care what it takes. But there was no way to really hook the wires up, especially the catch wires. There was no system back then because everybody had wood posts, and you could see how they were going to be on their way out in 10 or 20 years because people would, to hold the catch wires, they would just put a nail in at a 45-degree angle, and of course as the post weathered and aged, those nails would pop out, and then you get them in your tractor tire, and you'd spend half a day at the tractor dealer getting your tire fixed. And so I just thought, steel would be the way to go. So this was actually the first all-steel trellis system in Oregon. There were some guys, Winquist and Seeley, and they had a steel system too, but they had wood end posts and only single wire, so everything just hung. I took every post out here. I think it's like 1,600 T-posts. Took them one by one down in Bill and Julia's basement, drilled 8 holes in each of them, took them back out, threw them in the car. dumb stuff like that. You do when you're, in your 30s, and you wouldn't do again, but it seemed like the only option at that time.
And you used to live on the vineyard.
Yeah, for 2 years I lived here in a trailer. There was didn't have enough money to gravel the road, didn't have enough money to put a well in. The well was here, but there was I couldn't figure out how to get a pump down it. Actually, the couple that I bought it from, Cecil and Doris Ziegler, it's now Guadalupe Vineyard where they lived, and they owned 3 or 4 other parcels that were all pretty much in prunes or cherries. And so one day I was up measuring the well, and this was after Cecil had passed away, and this old guy came through the property carrying a deer rifle, and he looked like he had these sort of Coke bottle glasses, and he said, "Have you seen a deer come through here?" And I thought, you shouldn't be carrying a gun, let alone hunting. Couldn't see the piece of toast at 50 yards. But I said, no, I hadn't seen your deer. And he said, what are you working on? I said, well, Cecil Ziegler, that I bought this place from, he said this well is 160 feet deep, and I can only get down like 140. And I can't figure out what's, if he told me wrong or what. And this guy says, well, he said, I was here when Cecil was pulling that pump, and he dropped the last 20 feet of it in the hole. He couldn't get it back out. So then I thought, how am I going to get that out? And I went down to the farm store, and they had something that was kind of like a equivalent of a Chinese finger trap that you could lower on a cable, pull it up, and it caught that, pulled it out. But yeah, lots of little happenstance things that there's timing, I guess, basically. So, a lot of the vineyard things are pretty much timing related. You can do it pretty much any task out here. If you do it at the right time, it's going to take you X amount of hours. And if you do it at, 2 weeks later, it's going to take you 3X. And that's a real learning experience. Because you come from the world of academia or whatever, or geology, and you think, well, if I wait, it's just going to take the same amount of time. But with something growing, no, it's another bucket of worms.
How has your wine making changed, and how has the wine changed in the years you've been making wine?
Winemaking hasn't changed that much. I used indigenous yeasts when I started, and then there was a section of kind of cool years like 2010, 2011 where the fruit's going to come in late. It's going to be cold. It's going to probably have some botrytis in it that you might not be able to sort out 100%. So it's very important to get the fermentation off and running so you don't get a lot of undesirable bacterial growth or VA. So for a number of years I used a cultured yeast, which gives you the advantage of a big inoculum, and so the fermentation just pops. And then back about the same time I modified my trellis, I went back to indigenous yeast because I was noticing that a lot of the cultured yeast that you would get from a wine supply store, they have nitrogen requirements, so you have to give them a little feeding, and then the temperature spikes. Then you have to turn on the cooling, and then you have to wait till that subsides, and then feed it again, and it spikes again. So I went back to indigenous yeast, and it's a very nice linear fermentation. I've always done manual punch downs, just gravity in the barrel, and then there's basically one racking where I just use nitrogen gas pressure, and then sits in barrel for 20 months, 22 months, and a little fresh egg white fining, and then bottling. So it's pretty simple. It'd be nice to get a mobile bottling truck up the road, but as you can see, in your experience, it's not easily done. And I don't have, quite the water volume that they would need for something like that. Nor do I have three-phase power up here, so there's that. As you age, you'd like to have some aspects of the business get a little less taxing physically, but haven't figured out a way around that yet.
You might have chosen the wrong business for that.
May have, yeah. Yeah, this year was the first year I've had some people visiting, journalists that have asked my age, and that's kind of, a wake-up call. It's like when you apply for Social Security and things like that. But, yep, so far, stayed flexible and took up scuba diving 3 years ago. One of those things you put off, and you think, well, maybe I'll never do this, and then suddenly you find yourself doing it. So who knows? But yeah.
Well, I'm gonna come back to that in a second, but I'm curious about you talked about sort of some of the skills you've had and acquired. So tell me about in your opinion, what are the most important skills for a winemaker, or what have you found to be the most important skills for you to get here?
Winemaking is a lot like cooking. It's, your ingredients change from year to year, but I would say it's, you have fruit, you have a little bit of spice from the barrels. So the barrels are a big, I think people don't give enough credit to the effect of a barrel, or I should say the effect of a subtle barrel versus a less one. Initially when we started, people used, medium heavy toast barrels that you could really, there was a lot of barrel in Oregon Pinots back in the day. And now it's more fruit focused, I would say. And so I use a barrel that gives the wine a lot of structure, but there's not any char flavor. So it's a very light touch, basically.
And in terms of sort of construction or fixing of things, how have those sort of skills developed, and how have you sort of decided what you needed to have here and how to get it here?
Having the two fermenters from day one, that's been a big help, because you've got stainless steel that really doesn't need any maintenance. You've got cooling jacket, which I use pretty much every year. Sometimes you're warming the fruit up when it comes in, because if you're picking, like last year, we were picking the 23rd of October. And some years, like 2010, 2011, you're picking around Halloween and the fruit's coming in at 50 degrees, and it's going to sit there. If you're relying on indigenous yeast, it's going to sit there for maybe a week before it starts taking off. And so just a matter of turning on, I'm using well water basically, circulating that through, heated, and getting the fermentation started. Then conversely, a lot of our sugars are a little higher than they used to be. Back in '84, when I worked at Tualatin, you were lucky to get 19 bricks that year. And we don't have that problem anymore, luckily, knock on metal. The anachronism here, I think, is that people look at all these buckets that I have. We pick in individual buckets, and the fruit is only basically transferred once, so it hits the sorting table. And the only person I've run into who really likes that idea was a winemaker from the Rhone, because they're dumping fruit, and then it travels. I don't know how they get it to the winery, but you'd look back in California when they had these, people would pick in these 5-ton gondolas that were metal, and they'd pull them behind a pickup truck. Well, if you didn't process that fruit that day and it sat outside in the shade of the winery and it was, picked at 80 degrees and it sat in that metal container, when you dump that gondola, probably the last, 100 gallons had been fermenting in the bottom, and who knows what conditions with who knows how much botrytis or whatever had settled out. And so the washing of 500 or 600 buckets is not a lot of fun, but Duran does the same thing. They just use those what they call FYBs, when we first started picking, everybody would use these. Basically, it was all kind of the cherry picking technology. So everyone had these plywood totes or a 4x4 and put a liner in them, and that's what we'd pick into. And then we wouldn't start crushing until the crew left about 5 o'clock. Well, that meant you're up until midnight, 1 or 2 or whatever, loading fermenters. And so, as it is now, we start crushing within probably about half an hour of picking. And picking crew usually, they're usually up here having cervezas and tacos and whatnot from about 3 o'clock because they're done. And we're still processing fruit maybe till 6. And then if we're lucky and had enough daylight, then we're done. So, and then next day you've got 500 buckets to wash. So, yeah, but so I think it'd be nice to have an elevator, and as it is, we hire a couple guys. We used to have a guy from the Newburgh wrestling team who you didn't really even need to pay. It was a workout for him. Lift 900 buckets full of grapes and twice. But, you think of when you're just crushing one day and you think of you're trying to eliminate all the things that are going to go wrong. There's always one thing, and you lie awake the night before thinking, what is that one thing going to be? Is it a big thing? Is it a little thing? How can I plan for that? Some things like the smoke we had in 2020, you just can't plan for it. That's, you call it that's a black swan event. It's not anticipated, and it might never happen again. But other things, tractor breaking down in the middle of harvest. You've got a little bug in your fuel line. That's happened. Tractor doesn't work, and you've got your maintenance book back at the house in Carlton, and so then you have to switch equipment onto another tractor and keep everybody happy. So it'd be nice to have. I was over at Mike Etzel's winery a week ago, Sequitur, and it's just state of the art, everything, But when you have a group of people in there and you're going to be crushing for 3 weeks, if you're down one day, well, that's no big deal. But if you're like here and you're waiting until the very last minute to pick, and rain's going to be coming the next day, something better not break down. And so the fewer things that you can have that rely on electronics or motors or metric worm gears, the better. And so I tell people, I say, yes, it's all gravity, but gravity hasn't failed yet and probably won't in the near foreseeable future. So that's what we'll use. And yes, it's a little 17th century, but it works. So
if it does fail, you'll have bigger problems than the wine.
Yes. It's like when we were pouring concrete. Bill was helping me, Bill Wayne, and his vineyard guy, Jesus. And the walls are 12 feet high, foot thick concrete. Well, I've got a piece of electrical PVC conduit that the electric wires that run all the sconces and everything in the barrel room. And that goes in the wall, and it's down about 4 feet. So we were filling that wall with concrete, and suddenly just the force of the concrete split this one fitting. Luckily it was right on the corner. Realized that was the one that I hadn't glued. And I thought, for the next 50 years, I'm not going to have any lights in the barrel room, and I'm going to have to run conduit, outside on the wall. It's going to look awful. And I thought, how can I get, so I ran down, luckily had a can of PVC cement. And I said, Bill, you and Jesus have to suspend me. Luckily it was on a corner so I could fit in, and they put me down head first, each holding an ankle, and I had a can of PVC cement, and I cemented that and let it dry for about 5 minutes before we filled it up with concrete. And then, but the guy that did the inspection afterwards, he said, well, you can't have your electricity in the concrete like that. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, if there's ever a seismic event here and that PVC is severed, you won't have any lights. And I said, well, if there's ever a seismic event big enough to sever that PVC, I'm not going to be living here. So no worries. But yeah.
So you've talked throughout about some of the early founders and characters in the Oregon wine industry and your interactions with them. So tell me about, as you first traveled through here and then sort of settled here. Tell me about meeting some of those people and sort of your impressions of both the people making wine here in the 1980s in Oregon and the wines they were making.
Well, like I say, I would knock on doors and give everybody my list of 5 questions. I remember one day I was camping out at Champoy State Park and visiting wineries, and pulled into Amity, and it was like a Friday afternoon, about 4 o'clock. And Myron was always very busy, and he had a lot on his plate, you could tell. I think he had an assistant winemaker at that point, but they were filtering, getting ready to bottle. He was like doing stuff in the vineyard, working on a tractor. He had just a lot going on. But anyway, he was more than free with his time, and showed me the whole operation, and we tasted wines, and then he said, it's 5 o'clock, everybody's leaving. He said, well, what are you doing for dinner? And I said, I'm probably going to, go into a fast food place and get a hamburger and go back and camp out. And he said, we're just going to do a barbecue here. You want to join us? And I said, sure. So we went into Amity and got some steaks, and he fired up the barbecue. We're just ready to sit down for dinner, and his brother Steve is there. And it's getting to be about dusk, and we're looking out, and it's very bucolic. The vineyard was all, the shoots were all about like that. And we're just about ready to stick a fork into our steak and have a glass of wine. And Steve kind of squints out into the distance, and he said, Myron, is that a deer down there? He said, and Myron said, no, I don't think that's a deer. And Steve said, no, that's a deer. And then he gets up from the table and he takes off. And Myron says, oh, I know how this is going to play out. He's going to show up with his deer rifle. And he said, we're not going to have dinner for a couple hours. He said, the last time this happened, he said, Steve winged the deer. We tracked it, he said, past midnight, and it ended up collapsing in the sheriff's yard down in town. And I don't know, he didn't elaborate on how they got the deer out of there, or how they avoided getting arrested or whatever. But I thought at that point, maybe this vineyard business is a little more complicated than, just planting and letting things grow. And David Lett was always, everything there was very organized. He was the only winemaker, I think, that definitely thought about what he was wearing that day. He would show up for work, and he always had a little Naugahyde apron that he'd put on, and so he was always immaculately dressed. Half the time if he was going out, he had, what you'd call a safari suit on, something like that. We had a party once, Ken Wright, when he had Panther Creek. We had such a big space, and we had some years where if everything got cleaned up and you had everything in barrel, we could stage a Halloween party. So we did a Halloween party a couple of times there. The theme of the second party was "Come as Your Alter Ego." And so Nick, who usually showed up at his restaurant just wearing a t-shirt, suspenders, belt, he and David Lett came as each other. So it was really funny to see David Lett dressed just in the t-shirt khakis, and then Nick in a safari suit. I don't know where he found one big enough to accommodate Nick, but yeah. And then, but yeah, everybody else. I mean, Dick Ponzi built a lot of his own equipment because of his background. He had one destemmer. We went over one day, Bill Wayne and another winemaker and I. Dick gave us the whole tour, and he showed us this destemmer he had that he had been using up until the previous vintage. And gosh, the fingers on the inside were all wood, the auger, basically. It was made in Austria or something like that, and we were just gobsmacked. We thought, how do you keep that thing clean, let alone how do you keep the thing from flying apart? And he said, well, it's worked, and it's made as 94, which was a great vintage, great wine from Ponzi. So we thought, well, maybe it's, not so much appearances as function.
And what did you think of the wines?
Gosh, that was the thing. We had our wine tasting group, but we could only taste Pinot once a year. And then you're out of wine. And then, so we had to taste a lot of sparkling wines because Rollin was a member of the group. But you'd run out of stuff to taste. So we do, wines from Italy, we do Burgundies, we do anything until the next Oregon vintage rolled around. The wines back then I remember David Adelsheim, he had I think it was like an 81, and he'd kept it back for like 3 years because it had kind of closed down. He'd initially released it, then he pulled it back, and then he released it again, and then he pulled it back again. And but it had it at Nick's, and it was just phenomenal as far as its density and structure, and it's just really beautiful wine. And so I learned early on that you couldn't write somebody off on the basis of one vintage. You had to keep trying every vintage because their style might change, or it was just a winemaking fluke. There were a few wines back then that had maybe had some slight flaws, VA or whatever, and you don't see that so much now. If you do see it now, the winemaker claims it's deliberate, which is a little different. The other thing that's changed now is it seems like everybody in the last, not everybody, but there's been this big push the last 5 or 10 years to sort of like revisit the ancient way of making wines. We're going to do amphora, or we're going to do ferment in concrete, or but a lot of times the concrete's not even lined with epoxy, so you're getting the effect of the lime neutralizing, and you'll have winemakers say, well, this compared to the stainless, the wine in concrete, it seems like it's a softer wine. Well, yeah, it's a softer wine. I say, you look at any old winery and you look at the concrete floor right below the bottom valve, and there's a depression because it's eaten away all the lime, and that's got to be neutralized by the wine. So so there's, I don't know, there's just as many vineyard fads, probably more vineyard fads than there are winemaking fads, but I've tried to avoid all those, I guess, and just kind of, it's getting harder, I think, to find wines that are, I want to say, classically made, I guess. Even in Portland, the wine shops I sell to now, I have to, if I'm just getting a case of wine, I have to say, I don't like Brett, I don't want this, don't want that, not too much oak, and to have to tell somebody that you don't really want any bread in your wine is kind of, I think I've had one Burgundy that had just a little bit, and it was an interesting, added some character to the wine, but usually it gets out of control. It's just a flaw.
So obviously you've seen most of the growth of the Oregon wine industry since you've been here. So, and besides just the pure size of it now, how else have you seen it change? What's different about Oregon wine now than when you started?
I think there's more of an emphasis on just marketing. There's more of an entertainment component than there used to be. Back when we started, and Veritas was open, there was no tasting fee, and then that became $5, and then it became $10, and then it became $20, and maybe $30, but you got that back if you purchased some wine, and then it became, a sit-down affair, and you had somebody coming to your table with 3 or 4 wines, and then, a little plate of crudités and whatnot, and so I think the focus is a little more on, we're going to sell you a higher end bottle, but the trade-off is that we acknowledge that you're only going to buy maybe 1 or 2 bottles. You're not going to walk out of here with a couple cases. So that's changed. And so there's some of us, like Cameron and myself, and stick in the muds, as it were, that are just going to go with the old model. And I don't know how the economics work out and something like that. Maybe it's positive. But you talk to CPAs that do the taxes for a number of wineries, and they say, out of every 10 wineries, 2 of them are making money, the other 8 aren't. And I think people are happy, in some cases, just having it as a hobby. It doesn't necessarily need to be something that's economically viable. There's some pretty large, well-known wineries that aren't making any money. Other parts of their portfolio are, and maybe they use that to offset the losses. But for me, you can't lose money every year. I can lose money once by not making wine in 2020, but I can't do that for multiple years.
So you talked earlier about sort of what's next, and so as you look ahead for yourself, what would you like to do? What's going to happen with Thomas, and what else would you like to do? Well, it's a good question, and I've been wrestling with that for the last 4 or 5 years. There was a wine shop. I just got an email from them the other day. They were talking about a winemaker who's now 90, and he's got 75 vintages under his belt. And I thought, well, yeah, you could go that far, but like I say, I constantly ask John Paul. I can't ask Russ Rainey because unfortunately he passed away. But we're all kind of in the same boat. We're the same age, and don't have any kids that want to take the business over. So yeah, what do you do? I really enjoy coming up here every day. Even if it's raining, I enjoy being out in the vineyard. It's almost like I feel that there's something missing in my day if I'm not up here. But the flip side of that is I don't want to be up here living here, because then I'd probably be working 24/7. So it's a double-edged sword there. I think going forward, we are going to have to think about what are we going to do about warming climate. Some people it's kind of interesting how large the picking window has gotten. It used to be, our picking window for Pinot might be 10 days. And then you have storms coming, and if you didn't get the fruit off by a certain date, usually by mid-October, forget it. And now it seems like every year we're blessed, and to the point where people are picking, they're worried more about acid and picking earlier, picking in September to avoid the heat. This vineyard seems to go into limbo, and I don't really get any flavors until around the 3rd week of September. So we've been picking, since
I think 2009 was the last year we picked in September. We've been picking in October every year. But with the road direction here running southeast, and the afternoon, the heat peaks around 4 o'clock, which is the same time the sun's about 90 degrees to the trellis. So starting to get more and more sunburn every year. And I compensate for that by pretty much dropping all the fruit on the west side. So I think, as long as people aren't greedy, you could still, make wine 10, 15 years down the road. But the alternative is using shade cloth, and that's an environmental mess because it doesn't last that long. You have to have some place to store it. And then how do you get rid of it? Back when everybody got phylloxera, it allowed people to kind of rethink their vineyard, and they could tighten up their trellis system, put in new posts, go to metal instead of wood. But now with warming, everybody's done that, and to change your road direction, that's a big deal. So you don't have an economic necessity of phylloxera where you have to rip everything out. So you don't have that luxury. But you look at, I was looking a couple of weeks ago, satellite photos of Napa Valley, because they're perfectly flat, so they can pretty much do any orientation regardless of topography. And there are vineyards there they've changed 90 degrees. And so I've thought about that, but to go northeast, southwest, then I'd have a bit of a terrace, and that engenders all sorts of difficulties, just mowing. What do you do in the vine row itself to keep the weeds down? So yeah, I don't know. It's going to be, I think that's the one thing that kind of keeps me going, keeps my curiosity going, is, what's going to happen, because that's going to be the next big hurdle we're all going to have to deal with, and how do you approach that? And so that's, I look at that as kind of more of a challenge than a reason to hit the exits.
Then last question for you. Obviously, you've had this brand, you've had this vineyard for a good long time now. What are you proudest of, or what is your biggest accomplishment?
I guess the thing that makes me proudest is when I hear people that just they'll take a wine of mine and put it into a tasting blind with a group of Burgundies, or take a wine to Burgundy and give it to a French winemaker and relay the expression that they get, because they're still, Burgundy is still kind of closed off in a way. I mean, some people are curious as to what's going on here, and others just need to have a good bottle placed in front of them and go, oh. Certainly we're getting a lot more interest, I think, not only from California, but from French, just because the price of land is so low here compared to Burgundy. I just wish that, there were some wines that some vintages you could freeze in time, and unfortunately that doesn't happen. The 2001 that I made, I think I would be happy drinking that against pretty much any Burgundy I've had in my life. But it only lasted like that for about 5 years, and now it's kind of fallen off the bell curve. 2002 is coming on, but trying to figure out, which vintage is at its peak when you only have a couple cases, that's a trick. But it's fun. And it always seems like the vintages that you had high hopes for aren't the ones that necessarily turn out to be the outstanding, Wowzow Pow vintages. It's always a vintage that you think, oh, I remember crushing this, and it didn't seem like it had any particular outstanding qualities back then, but now it's just blossomed. So it's, yeah.
Well, that's all the questions that I have for you.
Okay.
So is there anything I didn't ask that I should have, anything that we didn't cover here today
No,
that we should have covered?
No, no.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I appreciate you taking the time and sharing your story with us, and
Sure.
we'll let you off the hook.
Okay.